I'm glad you found your way here today. For 3 decades, the experts told us that the church was dying, that the pews would be empty by 2030, and that the next generation had finally outgrown the need for a creator. We watched the data points drop like a stone, seeing a spiritual wasteland, where young people traded the altar for the algorithm. But if you look closely at the edges of the map, something is happening that wasn't in the brochure. Imagine finding a heavy, hand-forged iron key buried under the floorboards of a hyper-modern, glass-walled apartment. It's cold, it's out of place, and it looks completely useless in a world of touchscreens. Yet, for some reason, you can't stop holding it. In the book of Jeremiah, there is a specific command that feels almost offensive to a culture obsessed with the new and the upgraded. The prophet records a divine instruction: stand at the crossroads and look, ask for the ancient paths, ask where the good way is, and walk in it. For years, we thought the youth would only respond to laser lights, smoke machines, and a cool version of the gospel that didn't ask too much of them. We spent millions trying to make the church look like a tech startup. But look at the faces in the pews of the most traditional, liturgical, and even difficult churches lately. You'll see 20-something men with Bibles that have actual paper pages. You'll see them in high church cathedrals and small, dusty country chapels. The wound in our culture is a profound sense of unreality, a digital exhaustion where everything is a performance and nothing is solid. They aren't running away from the old ways anymore. They are sprinting toward them because the new ways left them starving. This is the silent awakening. It's not being led by a celebrity pastor with a podcast. It's not being driven by a marketing budget. It is a quiet, rhythmic return to the weight of the sacred. When the world became light, airy, and meaningless, the Spirit began pulling a generation toward things that have heaviness. The first sign of this shift appeared where we least expected it: the secular college campus. In 2023, at Asbury University, a routine chapel service didn't end. There was no professional worship leader on stage, no programmed experience, just a few students who stayed to pray. That staying turned into weeks of 24-hour worship that drew thousands from across the globe. It wasn't a riot, it was a rest. We are seeing a generation that has been overstimulated since birth, finally finding a place where the noise stops. They are discovering that the Spirit of God doesn't need a Wi-Fi connection or a hype man to fall on a room. This spontaneous combustion of faith is now leaping from campus to campus, often characterized by one thing: a lack of ego. But there is a second sign, and it's perhaps more confusing to the secular world. It's the return of the young man. For years, the narrative was that men were checking out of faith. Yet today, there is a surge of young men seeking out the most rigorous, traditional forms of Christianity. They are looking for the iron in the faith. They are asking for confession, for fasting, for a God who is a judge and a king, not just a life coach. They've realized that the digital world offers them unlimited content, but zero authority. When everything is your truth, nothing is actually true. These men are holding that heavy iron key, feeling its weight, and realizing it belongs to a door that actually leads somewhere, a door that requires a cost to enter. Before we look at the final, most jarring sign of this awakening, I want to ask you something directly. If you feel that same pull toward the ancient paths, if you are done with the shallow and ready for the deep, type the old paths in the comments below. Let's see how many of us are hearing the same call. The third sign is the death of the rebrand. For a long time, the church tried to be relevant. We changed the music, we softened the language, we hid the crosses. But the silent awakening is proving that relevance was the wrong goal. Gen Z doesn't want a church that looks like their Instagram feed. They want a church that looks like eternity. They want the incense, the hymns, the direct confrontation with the holiness of God. We are witnessing a theological cliffhanger. The world assumed that as science and tech advanced, the primitive need for God would vanish. Instead, the more advanced we become, the more the soul screams for the transcendent. We thought the key was lost, or that the lock had been changed by the hands of progress. But look at the lock again. The high-tech, digital solutions to the human heart. The therapy apps, the social media validation, the political tribalism, they've all jammed. They won't turn. And suddenly, that heavy, hand-forged iron key feels like the most valuable thing in the room. When you slide it into the mechanism of a broken life, it doesn't just fit, it turns with the weight of 2,000 years of certainty. The revelation is that God isn't trying to catch up to the modern world. He is the destination the modern world is accidentally running toward as it flees its own emptiness. The fire isn't coming from the spotlights, it's coming from the embers of the ancient altars. This isn't a trend, it's a homecoming. Are you brave enough to stop running and ask for the ancient paths?